everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the M2 iPad Air and compare it against the iPad 9th generation and see if there's one specific one you should buy. Most likely you're probably watching this video because you have an iPad 9 and you're wanting to see if you want to upgrade to an M2 iPad Air. Hopefully I can answer that by the end of this video. The big thing though to keep in mind is that if at any point you want to buy one of these particular iPads, you can use the links down in the description and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside, actually let me start off with the idea behind these iPads. The iPad Air M2 model and the iPad 9 are two different iPads for two different markets. But if you had an iPad 9, an M2 iPad Air might seem like a really good stepping stone rather than buying something like the iPad 10. The iPad Air M2 model is bringing a lot of capability and it's a really good solid upgrade coming from the iPad 9. On the front side of the iPad 9 generation, you were getting a 10.2-inch Retina IPS panel on it. It was a good display and it was actually a really nice display for how cheap this iPad was. You're getting a bezel on the top and the bottom with the home button. So the bezels are substantially bigger than the iPad Air M2 model, but this was still a very good looking display. I think this iPad looked really good for when it came out with, and I still think it's a very, very good sharp panel. Is it an OLED panel? Is it the 90,000 hertz panel? No, but it's a good looking panel for a cheap iPad, and I do think this was a really, really nice thing going on for this particular device at that time. On the other side with the M2 iPad Air, on this one, you're getting an 11-inch liquid retina IPS panel. So this one is still an IPS panel, but it is substantially bigger than the iPad 9. However, funny thing, it doesn't seem like it's a crazy bigger iPad because the iPad 9th generation did have the bigger bezels. So although it's still a bigger iPad, it was giving you kind of like, less bezel on it. So that's kind of a big thing to keep in mind. And there's no home button on that particular iPad either. And there's actually more colors you can choose from on the M2 iPad Air model too, which is another cool thing. Now the display itself looks good. There's not really too much to hate on here either, but you are getting a wider color gamut as far as I can tell on something like the iPad, Air 6 model than the iPad 9th generation. On the bottom, you're getting a USB Type-C port on the iPad Air M2 model, where the standard iPad 9 is giving you a Lightning port. This in and of itself is another very big difference because if you're wanting the better I/O, something like the M2 iPad Air is going to be the better one there for you for sure. You're getting flat sides on the M2 iPad Air 2, which is another really nice thing. Having flat sides is way more modern rather than this curved side that you're getting on the iPad 9. Again, it's not the biggest deal in the world, but that is just one other minor thing you have to keep in mind with this particular iPad as well. On the backside, single camera setups in the top left corner. You're getting your Apple logos in the center. Very good type of stuff going on here. And I do think for the most part, these are very, very good these are very good iPads that still hold up very well from the build quality standpoint. The only thing I would probably say is that if you're wanting the more modern looking iPad, clearly the M2 iPad Air is the better one for you. And that is the one that's going to look better and more prominent than something like the iPad 9. So kind of keep that in mind in the back of your head as well. Now, when it comes down to the price tag standpoint of these particular devices, the iPad 9 was basically being sold for less than $300. I think there were some that were being sold for less than $200 with some deals or whatever. I forget about it though, so don't quote me on that. But you were still getting a very, very good performing looking iPad on something like the iPad 9th generation. But that price tag is substantially cheaper than something like the M2 iPad Air. So when you look at the M2 iPad Air, that iPad is definitely going to be looking much better, significantly better in every single way, but it's $599. It's substantially more expensive, and the Wi-Fi Plus Cell model is $749. So that's another very big thing going on for this particular iPad as well. So if you're looking at it from that standpoint, you're definitely going to be getting a longer lasting, you're going to be getting a newer iPad on the M2 iPad Air model, but you have to keep in mind it is also more expensive. So it's just one of those things to keep in mind there too. So keep that in mind, but that's kind of how I see these particular iPads from that standpoint. Now, from the camera side of things, this is another interesting thing. So when it comes down to here, the iPad 9th generation on the back side from the camera had a single 8 megapixel camera, where the iPad Air M2 model is giving you a single 12 megapixel wide angle camera. So you're going from a 1080p sensor on the iPad 9 to a 4K video sensor on the iPad Air M6 model, or iPad Air M2 model. This is another big thing to keep in mind. The front cameras are almost identically the same, which is pretty crazy. So if you're looking at both these, iPads, you're actually going to be getting very, very similar type of experience between both, which is actually pretty crazy. So if you're buying one iPad over the other one, you're actually going to be getting a better camera on something, like the iPad Air M2 model, but the front cameras are almost identical. You're getting center stage on both, which is another very cool thing. And I do think if I'm going through and buying some sort of an iPad, I actually like both these cameras and both these iPads do a really, really good job when it comes down to that standpoint. Is it perfect? No, clearly not, but there's a lot of reasons why the iPad Air 9 still holds up pretty well against the iPad Air, M2 model. But if I'm going to pick up one, I think the iPad Air M2 model is the better one, and that one's giving you a way better back camera as well, and you can film 4K at 60 on the back of the iPad Air 6, whereas on the iPad 9, not so much, only 1080p video, which is kind of a downside when it comes down to both these phones. So, and I said phones again, I meant iPads. So when it comes down to the camera side, that's kind of how I see both these iPads holding up from that particular standpoint. Now, when it comes down to the software longevity, I'm going to be honest, there really isn't that much more competition here. I would probably say, if I had to estimate, I have no idea, basically I cannot predict the future, but if I had to kind of estimate, I would probably say the iPad 9 generation has like another 2 years of software updates, 3 if we're lucky. But I would probably say it's going to last the remainder of 2024, the remainder of 2025, and then it's going to be sunsetted in 2026. It actually might end up, ending probably in 2025 next year. I have no idea, but that's what I'm going to assume. Either 2025 or 2026 in the next 2 to 3 years, it's going to be done. Whereas on the iPad Air M2 model, this one is just getting started. This one just got started getting software updates. So this is a big thing you have to keep in mind, that if you're going to go and buy one iPad over the other one, these two iPads clearly are going to be a little bit different when it comes down to the software longevity. And you're definitely going to be getting a longer lasting iPad on something like the iPad Air 6. That iPad is going to be lasting for a long period of time. If you're wanting the longer lasting phone, there's a clear answer here. The iPad is going to be, the iPad Air 6 is going to be the longer lasting one here. And that's exactly how I feel, going to the future, predicting these iPads and, their lifespans. That's kind of what I can say. But when it comes down to the performance, it's another big difference. The iPad 9 generation has that Apple A13 Bionic chip inside of it. The iPad Air 6 has that M2 chipset inside. The M2 chipset is a desktop level chipset. It's like what they put in their Macs and their iMacs and stuff. It's crazy that Apple's, giving us this type of chipset in this particular iPad. So it's a very, very cool thing that we're getting here. You have to keep that in mind. So the performance levels are going to be very different. With the iPad 9, it was good. If you're doing basic stuff, it's basically like an iPhone 11 type of chipset. So what you can do in an iPhone 11, you can do here. It's a good performing phone, or it's a good performing iPad. It can do a lot of stuff that you probably want to, do on your particular iPad. And I do think it's a very, very cool thing. But the M2 iPad Air is a substantially faster performing chipset when it kind of comes down to it. And that particular iPad is going to be able to handle so many things you throw at it. It's not even funny. And I love the iPad Air, M2 model. I think it's a substantially better iPad. If you're trying to edit videos or play games and heavy intensive stuff and all that stuff, you're going to be getting an overall better experience on the iPad Air M2 model than the iPad 9. So that kind of covers it up there as well. And if I'm being completely honest, I think there's a clear answer here and there's a clear winner. If you have all the money in the world, then just go for the M2 iPad Air. That is going to be the better iPad that I would recommend a vast majority of people to go ahead and buy. And that's the one that I would constantly go to as probably being the better one for every single person. If you have all the money in the world, then why wouldn't you just go for something like the iPad Air M2 model? That's kind of the one that makes the most amount of sense to me. But here's what I'll probably say about essentially the iPad 9. It's still a very good iPad. I think there's still a lot of capability behind that particular device. And I look at something like the, iPad Air, iPad Air 6 is still being a really good iPad. But I do think for the most part, the iPad Air, the iPad 9 is still a very good cheap iPad. And I think that's a very, very solid option when it kind of comes down to it. So when it comes down to that, that's kind of how I see this particular iPad holding up and these two kind of comparing. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.